Order. Welcome to meeting number 21 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Agriculture and Agri-Food. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. Before we continue, I'd like to ask all in-person participants to consult the guidelines written on the cards on the table. These measures are in place to help prevent audio feedback incidents and to protect the health and safety of all participants, including our interpreters. You'll also notice a QR code on the card which links to a short awareness video if necessary. I'd like to make a few comments for the benefit of the witnesses and the members. Please wait until I recognize you or you're asked a question directly by a member before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you're not speaking. For those on Zoom, at the bottom of your screen, you can select the appropriate channel for interpretation, either floor, English, or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. For members on Zoom, please use the raise hand function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can, and we appreciate your patience and understanding in this regard. Pursuant to Standing Order 108-2 and the motion adopted by the committee on Thursday, September 18, 2025, the committee is resuming its study on reference price in beef and pork supply chain. I'd like to welcome our witnesses. Thank you so much for joining us here today. First, from Beretta Farms, Mr. Thomas Beretta, who's the general manager. True North Foods, Calvin Vags, President and Chief Executive Officer. And from Van des La France, Indira Moody, Chief Executive Officer. Thank you so much for joining us here today. I know many people travel far to be here. Thank you for your support for the agriculture sector. And each witness will be given 5 minutes to speak. And when there's 30 seconds left, I'll just give you a quick, gentle warning. So we'll start off with Mr. Beretta for 5 minutes.
Well, good day, all. Mr. Chair, thank you for the invitation and opportunity to appear before the Standing Committee on Agriculture and Agri-Food today. My name is Thomas Beretta, General Manager of Beretta Farms, a multi-generational Canadian family-owned and operated meat business. Founded by my parents in southwestern Ontario, Beretta Farms' roots are grounded in the traditional methods of cattle farming through organically raising our animals and offering Canadians and the world a premium option for their protein needs. Today, with operations across the country, we are proud to be Canada's leading meat provider in the organic and antibiotic and hormone-free categories, and Canada's largest exporter of beef into Europe. We take pride in our niche branding and abilities to grow, process, and market Canada's premium beef and bison. Our federal slaughter facility is located in the small rural town of Lacombe, Alberta, and is approved to process beef, bison, and elk. We are eligible to export to markets such as Europe, US, Japan, Korea, UAE, and China. Our volumes put us in the small processor level, but our role in the food supply chain is essential. Not only does our plant market our product, but we also offer processing solutions for other third-party meat brands looking to market meat in local and national markets. This gives our business a unique perspective on some of the government's current policies. As you may be aware, small meat processors in Canada's beef sector are currently operating under a series of regulatory and market pressures that limit our ability to compete and serve consumers effectively. With our facility being in a rural town in central Alberta, access to skilled labor in the meat processing industry is extremely limited. We rely on temporary foreign labor to fill in critical positions that are nearly impossible to hire in the domestic labor market. With the closure of the Agri-Food pilot in 2025, it has created an overwhelming sense of uncertainty for both the company and our workers. We are currently operating in an unknown period whereby our foreign staff are either being refused PR status or stuck in limbo, not being able to work, waiting for a decision. We are forced to renew temporary statuses of individuals and cannot grow our labor force as we must adhere to a 20% cap on foreign workers. Without an extension or a clear pathway to move temporary foreign workers into permanent resident status, we risk losing skilled workers that cannot be replaced locally. This directly undermines food security and production capacity initiatives and puts small meat processors in rural areas under unnecessary pressures to operate efficiently. The current permanent residency options for temporary workers are not good enough, and it will continue to put a strain on our business operations if no improvements are made. We stand by the Canadian Meat Council's request for the government's amendments, and I strongly recommend to follow through with the request of extending the labour market impact assessment to 2 years, currently at 1, improve the support of the provincial nominee programs, and create a sector-specific immigration stream to ensure food processors get the staff they need. The last topic I would like to touch on involves the closure of the Lacombe Research and Development Centre. Being a meat processor in the town of Lacombe, we have always worked very closely with and have had an invaluable resource in this government branch of research and development. With the announcement by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, the news comes as a sad blow to the country's ability to continue to excel in the meat processing and agricultural development sectors. The value of the relationships and resources built with our close ally at the LRDC are hard to put into words. I ask the committee, if we want to remain competitive with other beef-producing countries, how will we do it without government support to develop the best food production practices both at the farm and at the processing levels? In closing, I would like to say Beretta Farms is committed to providing Canadians and the world with the very best beef and bison products this country has to offer. We feel strongly about our role in the food system and need the government support to improve our current labour and immigration systems in order to produce the high-quality products that our customers expect to receive. Thank you for the opportunity to share in our experiences, and I welcome any questions you have.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Next, we'll go to True North Foods for 5 minutes.
Well, I'd like to thank the chair and the members for asking us to participate in this meeting. It's a privilege, and I thank you very much. My name is Calvin Voggs, and I am here representing True North Foods. True North Foods is a federally inspected packing plant in the middle of the country. We are right in Manitoba. Our closest federal beef packing plant to the west is in Brooks, and our closest one to the east is in Guelph. So we cover a wide geographical area. We employ right now about 160 people, process about 180 animals per week. So we're a relatively small plant, but I feel that we are very, very important geographically and very, very important as a foundation to our industry within Canada. Just a little bit more background on myself. I also farm, and I have a lot of extensive experience right through the beef value chain, from cow-calf to feeding cattle, finishing cattle, as well as retail and wholesale. So I have a pretty well-rounded view of the entire beef value chain in Canada and really globally. So the topic that you asked us to speak on was beef reference pricing as it pertains to the U.S. And as everybody knows, and that is very true, both in pork and beef, and I'm going to primarily talk about beef, of course, our pricing does start in the U.S. And there's a reason for that. I mean, we work in a global market. Canada produces more beef and more animals than we consume ourselves. So the U.S. is our closest market, and it becomes a relief valve. We have free and open trade with the U.S., and it's very, very important that we keep that trade going. If you remember, in BSC, we had in 2003 that border was closed for a period of time, and it was devastating to our beef prices and our beef industry within Canada. So yes, our prices do start out in price discovery through the U.S. market. That's not a bad thing, but having said that, when it does come and get converted to a Canadian price, there's basis considerations with freight and regulation and many, many things there. And those things perhaps we could look at to get better transparency for the Canadian consumer, better transparency for government, better transparency and competitiveness for the, some of the smaller processors that don't have that insight into that market. So I'd like to talk a little bit about some of those things. The key point, though, is that U.S. reference pricing should not be considered the enemy, but it is incomplete when we apply it to Canada without adjustments. So I suspect that part of the reason why this committee has been convened is to look at and address, why are beef prices so high? And I'd like to talk about that a little bit. Really, the reason that we have such high beef prices in Canada and in the U.S. is not necessarily just a cyclical market structure or market, a cyclical market, but more coming at a structure that is not performing the way it should. And what I'm getting at here is over the last 20 years, our primary producers, our cow-calf industry, has not made enough money, has not been profitable enough, prosperous enough, did not have the motivation to reinvest in the industry. So what has happened is our supply on cattle has shrunk more than it should have to stimulate new supply. Like normally the supply goes down, demand goes up, we get higher prices, we stimulate rebuilding of the herd, and that is taking too long. And the reason being is because these guys haven't made enough money, they haven't had enough support over the last 20 years, and now we have a critical supply shortage. And it's going to take some very deliberate action to try to get that supply back. So that is one thing I'd really like to drive home. The beef prices are not high because of artificial doings or things like that. They're really high. Pardon me? 30 seconds. Oh, boy. That went pretty quick. The other thing I'd really like to talk about is the plight of the small beef packer. The small beef packer is going to have the same situation that the cow-calf industry is in if we don't do something with it pretty soon. We need support for the 15% of the beef processing industry that is not getting support now. And if we don't do something with that, we're going to have the same effect that we had with cow-calf producers not building enough supply. So I think my 30 seconds are probably up now.
Yeah.
I'm really happy to answer questions. I
There'll
do
be
far
lots
better
of
with
questions.
questions than
Yeah.
rambling on. So,
Ms. Moody, 5 minutes.
Président, Mesdames et Messieurs les députés.
Committee members, and Mr. Chair, thank you for giving me the opportunity to appear before you today. My name is Indira Moody. I am President and CEO of Viande La France, an independent, federally inspected slaughterhouse and meat processor, not vertically integrated with a farm and based in Quebec. We employ approximately 40 people and work with close to 40 family farms across Quebec. Founded in 1929, our company has weathered wars, recessions, and major crises, including the COVID period, during which most large slaughterhouses and protein processors in North America shut down, while our local facilities remained operational 365 days a year, ensuring continuity of regional food supply and contributing to food sovereignty. Today, what weakens SMEs like ours is not a one-off shock, but a structural imbalance in the Canadian beef system, which has led between 2019 to today to a decline of more than 35% in the number of cattle slaughtered at our facility, and details are provided in the brief that I have submitted. In the beef sector, we know that 85% of processing capacity is controlled by 2 companies, and the remaining 15% is shared among 8 to 9 independent federally inspected slaughterhouses, including ours. In the context of your study on reference prices, my message is straightforward. The reference price, as it is currently used, does not reflect the economic realities of independent Canadian processors. It has become a benchmark that effectively excludes SMEs, even when they are compliant, efficient, and locally rooted. Let me give you a concrete example. 3 months ago, we were approached by a major retail banner seeking to offer Quebec beef, identified under Aliments du Québec designation, across nearly 200 stores. From a technical standpoint, we met all requirements: federal inspection, quality standards, traceability, and production capacity, yet we were unable to submit a bid. Why? First, our pricing was benchmarked against Canadian beef processed in the United States, within cost structures and volumes that bear no resemblance of those to an independent Canadian SME. Second, supplying such volumes requires significant working capital at a time when cattle prices are at historic highs. A pressure further amplified by reference prices that fail to account for the realities of Canadian processing. This case reflects a well-documented reality. in particular explored in the Front de Boeuf podcast, which I strongly encourage committee members to consider as part of this study, and which I reference in the brief that I submitted in support of my testimony. The conclusion is clear. Demand for local product exists, retailers are ready, farms have the animals, and slaughterhouses have the capacity, yet the current economic mechanics prevent local supply from meeting the market. Over the long term, Canada's food security, sovereignty, and the resilience of its beef system depend on diversification, support for producers and independent processors, and a coordinated, concerted effort among public and private stakeholders at the federal and provincial levels. In this context, a Canadian official price publication based on actual transactions would contribute to transparency that is better aligned with the realities of Canadian beef processing. It is against this backdrop that, in collaboration with the 8 to 9 independent federally inspected beef processors and with the support of the Canadian Meat Council and Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, before whom we have presented these issues, we have submitted a structured collective solution, and I would refer you again to the attached documents. The proposed solution is built around a targeted safety net triggered when margins fall below a historical threshold, along with temporary liquidity support mechanisms to stabilize independent processors without distorting the market, but while protecting employment, national capacity, and food security. I will conclude by saying that Canada must ask itself 3 fundamental questions. 1, do current rules genuinely allow independent slaughterhouses to play their strategic role? 2, is economic risk fairly shared across the supply chain or concentrated on its most vulnerable links? And 3, and finally, do we want our beef processing capacity to rest in the hands of a few dominant players or on a network of local infrastructures capable of absorbing shocks? Thank you for listening. I'll be pleased to answer your questions.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to all of our witnesses. We'll start with the Conservatives. Mr. Epp for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing. This is the Ag and Agri-Food Committee, and so I think we share 2 goals. One is that we're all, particularly in today's context, trying to look for ways to lower food prices for Canadians, but we're also looking for transparency and fairness in our value system, Canadian-based or wherever it fits in the world. So to that end, we've studied the Grocery Code of Conduct and a whole bunch of other things that lead to that. So Mr. Baggs, your testimony is exactly where my head is, because I come from 2 spaces experientially, one within the grain sector, so I'm familiar with how that's marketed off of a U.S. reference price, Chicago Board of Trade, and a local basis, and the vegetable sector, which in California often dominates. This is processing. So I've negotiated contracts with roughly the same framework. It's not as transparent, but basically U.S. dominates worldwide pricing there, basis California, and then we negotiate what the basis values are. We know what exchange. We can find that information. So my brain followed your testimony around of how that goes. So what's missing in the beef trade to bring that basis negotiation some more transparency? Can you comment? And I'm going to go then to both other witnesses as well.
So I think there's lots of things in your comments there to unpack, but if I pinpoint it down to the one thing that we don't have in Canada that is really missing is mandatory pricing. You know, in the U.S., since USDA was created, you can get a price twice a day, every single commodity.
Sorry, mandatory pricing or mandatory price reporting?
Mandatory price reporting. Thanks for the correction. That's a big difference, yeah. But that is one thing that in Canada we really lack. We have no visibility into any kind of commodity trade, what's happening in Canada. The only thing that we can do is, you know, we pull up a USDA sheet, we take the Canadian exchange, and that's our starting point. And from there now, we go to the market and we negotiate. And it's okay if you're a big enough player, because now you've got visibility into a lot of things that the smaller producers don't have. But you mentioned fairness. That's where us as small packers can really, really struggle. You know, we start out with what we think is a fair price, but we do not see what the large players are doing. And the large players are both on the buy side and the sell side. So this is, in essence, that's the one thing that's really, really makes a difference.
Follow up before I go to the other 2 witnesses. Yeah. Mandatory price reporting both on the buy side and the sell side?
You're talking on cattle?
Yes.
So the cattle we actually have better, and we actually get good information. get, direct bids out of Alberta. You have pretty, current, up-to-date information on your purchasing side. But it's really on the sell side, on the product side.
On the product
Yeah.
side. Thank you. Mr. Beretta can comment, please.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with what Calvin said. If we want transparency, we need to cut ties and look at commodity pricing with what's being sold and bought in Canada. In order to do that, you need to report on the pricing and have visibility. I'm repeating Calvin's words here, but he nailed it on the head.
Thank you. Ms. Moody?
Question de savoir si le mécanisme actuel
So you're asking if the current mechanisms are good for Canadian resiliency? My answer is clear in its current form. It continues to weaken, not intentionally, but in what we observe. So yes, having reporting upstream and downstream of Canadian prices, yes, it is important. Furthermore, our consumers want to buy Canadian. They want to consume a product from their own province, but we don't have the opportunity to show the true price of what that is. Our prices are compared to other prices, which are compared to American prices. So we're not able to detach from that. Currently, the 9 federal cattle slaughterhouses can take on more capacity just for one shift. Imagine if you have 2 shifts, we could produce more Canadian product right here at home and feed our consumers.
Follow up, Ms. Moody. If there was a pricing transparency, because I'm hearing in all 3 of your testimony, you're facing something by processing in Canada that your American competitors are not. Would more transparent pricing around the basis address some of those additional costs you face in Canada, or are there other solutions that need to come forward that address the cost that you incur in Canada that your U.S. competitors don't?
Alors oui, le prix en question.
Yes. The price needs to be more transparent. Then we'll know where we're at. So yes, more measures need to be taken. Which measures? Well, what was submitted and what I referred to in my presentation. So there are 2 points. Have a safety net and be able to have the funding to be able to prosper. If we have those elements, transparency, thank you.
Thanks.
So there's, the big one there is regulation. And I think everybody here is probably familiar with the one regulation that stands out that
SRM.
really has put us behind is SRM.
Yeah.
Now, we're getting that rectified. That looks like we're going to have a pretty decent solution on that probably, in the next 6 to 12 months. But that's one example. And there's, if you look at regulation as a whole, we get stung a lot with extra costs on regulations that our U.S. counterparts do
I just
not
want to be
have.
fair to Mr. Beretta as
Yeah.
well. Thank you. Mr. Beretta?
Yeah, I would say the same thing. Bottom line, there's a cattle shortage, which is leading to the price increases. Let's not
Yes.
deviate from this. With that being said, all of us as small processors deal with different factors based on the regions we're in and how we run our operations, and we're here to try to keep that alive.
But you would be in favor of more transparency in the pricing as well?
For sure. We need to tie ourselves off. Canada as an economy is its own. Let's look at other ways to be more independent.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Next, we'll go to the Liberals for 6 minutes. MP Chatel.
Merci, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for being here. So I think that this study comes at a very timely moment because we're hearing more and more talk of sovereignty, food security, and so forth. And if I'm understanding correctly, that is a point that all 3 of you are making here, that if we want to go and get that food security, meat is, of course, very essential to our protein consumption, but also we need to be independent in our data and in the way that we define a price for the Canadian market. If we want to grow our Canadian market, we need to start there. We're going to hear from witnesses from the department in the second hour today. So what is the message regarding transparency that you would like to send to them? Because we have not yet heard from witnesses who would be against defining prices for the Canadian market. So can you give us your recommendation for that, how to implement this transparency? We'll start with Mr. Beretta.
Yeah, I think from what we said, more transparent pricing. the sale and buying will help get the database and the actual numbers of what's happening in the Canadian beef production industry. So that would be my recommendation.
Et est-ce qu'on le fait basé sur
And do we do that based on the industry, in partnership with the industry, or do we do it Canada-wide, or do we use the American model to do that? How do we implement it, that transparency?
It would have to be Canada-wide. It would have to look at all scopes of all the transactions happening within the economy.
Excellent, Monsieur Vague?
Excellent. Mr. Vag.
So I think most of the mechanics are already there. If you wanted to implement it, it could be implemented relatively quickly. Most of the all of the federal packing plants would have the capability of reporting. There's many things that we have to report on already. So it would be essentially, you have to say what entity is going to collect those prices. It has to be done, third party and independent, so that, or not independent, it's not the right word, but you can't have competition issues coming out of it. Mm-hmm. So it has to be put together carefully so that you can't tell whose price is what. But you could probably replicate USDA somehow.
Mm-hmm. Madame Moody?
Je dirais que
Ms. Moody, I would say that copying is not the right term, but perhaps adapting to. So the structural and regulatory and the financial numbers need to be based on Canada. So we need to act structurally. There is not a federal framework. We need the real volume. We need data. So we need to know the real volume. We need the prices of transactions. And we need to have aggregated data. There are not 1,000. There are only 8 to 9 centers or plants. So it's quite easy. And we need to structure that. So we need to look at the different partners and have them speak to one another and be unified. We need to have a consensus from different stakeholders, but we already have the data. Thank you very much. I would like to discuss slaughterhouses because there are some in my region. One closed its doors and is going to reopen. It is important to process meat products locally. So I've heard about temporary foreign workers, and there is a dire need for those. They are a systemic part of this labor force, so I thank the witnesses for mentioning that. Now, when it comes to Canadian food security, a strategic fund of $500 million could support businesses in supply chains that are affected. And it would be able to be used in different sectors. But in my view, slaughterhouses are a priority in the Canadian food supply chain. In your opinion, could slaughterhouses benefit, or would they be good beneficiaries? So we'll go in the other order. Mr. Bretta first again.
Absolutely. In a time like we are now, where we're seeing unprecedented shortages of supply, we need to keep the small processors in the rural areas out of reach, offering opportunities and increasing competition for the market and benefiting Canadian consumers. We would certainly tap in. Where do we sign up?
Good. Monsieur Vague.
Yeah, I totally agree as well. I firmly believe that the small beef processors across the country are a food security concern that should be protected, that should be made sure they're made whole. And at Canada Meat Council, we have actually put together a proposal in front of the government. I believe there's a brief floating around to do exactly that, to come up with a support-based program based on principles much like the agri-stability program, although it doesn't have to be exactly the same, but something that takes historical margins and supports some of these entities when they really fall into a negative position, just so that we can keep these industries whole, or these processors whole within the industry. Because we feel it's very important. We're small, we're 15% of the industry, but look at the alternative. If you continue the course and they all get wiped out, you've got basically a very small handful of foreign-owned companies that control your food supply. And I don't think that's, I just don't think that's wise.
Okay, thank you so much. We'll go to the Bloc Québécois for 6 minutes.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Greetings to you, to colleagues, and thank you to our three witnesses for being here and for your presentations and the answers you're giving us. My questions will be for Ms. Moody to begin with. At the end of your presentation, you asked us three questions. I would like to come back to those regarding your proposal for liquidity, security, safety nets that you were proposing for your colleagues with independent slaughterhouses. Can you give us some more detail regarding those three questions? Thank you for the question. Mr. Chair, today, the system as it exists currently means that we are in a production shortage. The costs of production are high, and we're not able to get away from that. So, as I mentioned in my presentation, there are one-off shocks, and there have been 3 consecutive years that we have seen a downturn. And without support, that is, a safety net, we're not able to bounce back. So the question that we have to ask is, if we're not able to produce, there will be no more operations next year. So having a security net, a safety net rather, would help us to continue to operate. So the example that I gave you, if we don't have the funding to be able to operate, it's impossible to operate the way we want to. So we need to have funding safety to be able to meet the center's needs, the plant's needs. I think this is applicable to all slaughterhouses, and many slaughterhouses have lost a second work shift. So that program would help us with this problem and help us to get through this crisis. Thank you very much. Do you feel that the government has been hearing you when you've made this request and has heard you about the importance of food sovereignty, to not have to depend on multinational corporations, as Mr. Vags referred to? Do you feel heard? We feel that we are heard, but we will be heard all the more when we see what the response is to these real requests that we're making. We want food sovereignty, food security. And in 2019 to now, we have seen a decrease in 35%. Is that normal? No. So yes, we're talking about food sovereignty, but we're not being given the tools to achieve it. And that is what we're asking you for, because the consumers want that. If you can see everywhere which products are 100% Canadian, I can guarantee you that will make a difference. But in the first place, having that price established will be beneficial, and the price will stabilize, and then we'll be able to move forward from that. So labeling is an issue, the price is an issue, and that will all be beneficial to the consumer. Thank you very much. Now, when it comes to traceability, you talked about the podcast, Front de Bœuf. There is a microchip system in Quebec that was discussed. Could you give us more details, particularly regarding the fact that consumers want to know where their products come from? So we worked with 40 farms. In our plants, we can tell you exactly where our products come from. It comes from this farm, the animal ate this. We have this data, and it is very valuable. This is a Quebec product from this farm, but our power to do that is watered down by the fact that that's not asked for. So our diversity is at the heart of food sovereignty. And yes, of course, there's a price for being able to show this, but it is absolutely an affordable price for Canadians. Thank you very much. That is well noted. I'd like to come back to transparency for reference prices for beef and pork producers. We have been told that it would be beneficial to have increased transparency, you were telling us that the data is available, but what's missing is the structure, so the mechanisms to access that data. Could you give us more details on that? So, when we are asked to class a product, we process the product and we have the price. I can't pay the farmer any less than what he's asking for. So we take that price and the reference price that we're all working with has to be the same. So if we had that same reference price for everywhere in Canada, that could be seen for transportation, for everything, then we would be comparing apples to apples. And what would that do? We would be able to say, this product is 100% Canadian. Thank you. We just have a few seconds left. Can you tell us what you think about the concentration of slaughterhouses regarding multinational corporations? It's dangerous. We're currently at 13%, and we're not heading up towards 20%. Personally, I am worried for my slaughterhouse. We need, or rather I said when we began, that we stayed open 365 days a year during COVID. So continuity is important, and we need all the support we can get for that.
Thank you. We'll go to the Conservatives now for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm like Mr. Voggs and Mr. Beretta. I'm been also involved in a vertically integrated system in the cattle business. You almost have to be nowadays to really understand the full way the market works. And do you think that Livestock Mandatory Reporting Act, like they had in the United States, would be useful in Canada? Because we had something similar that's been discontinued. What would be your opinion, Mr. Voggs, on that?
So I think it would be very useful. I know we had it in the past through CanFax, and it never really was set up to be all that effective. It was, it always came too late. So I'm speaking for myself here. There may be others in the industry that disagree with me, but I really think if we, had a mandatory price reporting system that was robust and up to the minute, just like the USDA system, and it can have its variations, but that information, to get it at a critical time, is very important. If it comes a week late or 2 weeks late or it's incomplete, then you're almost better off not to have it. So I think if we went down that road, we'd want to have it up to the minute.
Yeah. So, Mr. Brett, I'm sure with a smaller process or mid-sized processing plant in Canada, it's very important for you to hedge your supply. So I'm sure, like Mr. Boggs, you would be in the feeding business. So you'd have your own supply of cattle to go. And with the Canadian and American cattle industry so integrated, and we know we want to stay away from anything that has to do with country of origin labeling, like we're fighting with the states now, because our system is so integrated. Like, for example, the United States plants in the Northwest wouldn't operate without Canadian cattle. What would be your suggestion when it comes to this mandatory pricing? And would you want to be completely Canadian information or still have a basis off of the American report?
Good question. It's a bit complex in the sense that the U.S. is the index, and it's a safe hedge in a way. But at the same time, when we look at the futures of fed cattle, for example, in a year out, and you're negotiating with the producer, you're kind of hedging. You got to factor in the exchange rate, where that's going to be in a year's time. There are a lot of factors that are a little bit unnecessary. If we have our own economy here, let's be less dependent on the U.S. pricing that way, and just look at what's going on in Canada.
Okay. When it comes to the prairies, I'm just going to stick with your two witnesses if I can at the moment. When it comes to the prairies, we know we have a real struggle with labor when it comes to operating our plants, and I'm sure it's the same in Quebec. We know that there was a pilot project for processing plants for temporary foreign workers, finding a way to permanent residency, and that has been discontinued. Maybe could you, Mr. Brett, just talk a little bit more about your struggles with this program and struggles with labor and what you would like to see in regards to this?
Yeah, so the agri-food pilot closed in 2025. They capped it off, and that was a 5-year program starting in 2020, and we greatly benefited from that. We were able to grow our labor force and bring in skilled workers. And when I talk skilled, this isn't regular labor intensive work. These are people that know how to use a knife, that can break down a carcass in fast line pace expectations. And currently, right now, there is no federal pathway. So we have to go through provincial nominee programs, which currently in Alberta, we're facing hurdles with that. Skilled meat cutters are not categorized the same as, let's say, a higher educational employee going into the health sector or IT sector. So we're constantly being rejected. We're not getting PR applications at all, which means we have to continuously, year after year, renew their temporary foreign worker status. And it's also hard on these employees. They come to Canada looking for a new opportunity. These are good people, hardworking people. They're not taking away Canadian jobs. I run an ad year-round for meat cutters, and I don't get anyone remotely with the skill work we need.
Yeah, this is something we've heard over and over and over again. Maybe I can shift gears really quickly to Mr. Vogg. So right now in the House today, we're debating a motion about grocery prices and how we can bring those down in Canada. And we hear often from the Liberals that they say there's imaginary taxes when we talk about the industrial carbon tax, when we talk about fuel standards, when we talk about packaging taxes. We know this is not true. As a primary producer, I can tell you, we see these costs. Can you maybe bring that up and explain what you see in your operation since it's vertically integrated?
So secondary cost of goods at the packing plant level, and that's where all that would come in. Our cost of packaging, freight, all of that stuff, where you have those layers of taxes built in, is huge. That's one of the hardest things to, you look at that number and you say, well, why in the world does it cost this much money? Aside from labor and aside from the cost of the cattle, you look at that pricing increment to get it in a box, and it's a substantial amount. And I'm not going to sit here today and tell you I know every level of tax that's embedded in there, but it's a big concern for sure.
Thank you.
Liberals for 5 minutes. And Mr. Perron, welcome back to the committee. Yeah. We thought you were gone forever, but here you are. We're all happy that you've returned. Over to MP Dan Duran for 5 minutes.
Merci à vous.
Thank you very much. And thank you to you three for your testimonies. They were very interesting. I am from a region where we have a lot of pork and beef processing, so I'm very alive to the issues you're bringing up. You were talking about how it's important to support small players in this industry. And you also mentioned that one of the issues is to have consensus and how important that is for publishing data. How confident are each of you that when it comes to slaughterhouses and processing, you will be able to reach a consensus? You seem to all agree that it is important to have a consensus. So how likely do you think it is that it will be possible to get one for that, defining that price? Ms. Mahdi, yes, I validate that. First of all, we have the data, and thank you very much for your great question. At each of the farms today, we see the importance of having data. We record data from every day that we operate, and we need also the willingness. So we need a federal and provincial governments to communicate. We need the public and private sectors to communicate as well to arrive at that price. So for me, it's absolutely doable, but we need the will. Mr. Vag.
Speak for others, but I'm fairly confident to say that within the cattle community, I think you'd get full support across the board. Small packers, you'd get full support across the board. Sorry about that. Really, the entire value chain, I think, would support this, other than large beef packers and large retailers. I think they would be against it.
Thank you. Are you of the same
Alvin stole
opinion?
my thunder a little bit. But I was going to say, I think you would get support from the producers and the small packers. The problem, and I mean, it's understandable, is we have two large packers in Canada, and most of the price setting and data is driven by their production and their results. So we'd have to get complete buy-in from the large companies for this to work sustainably.
Donc, si je comprends bien,
So if I understand it, your point of view is that there is a consensus for producers and smaller centers, but the bigger challenge is to have bigger players sign on, probably for competitiveness reasons, because they wouldn't want to share their prices. And how do you think we can rectify that or deal with that? How do you think we can take pressure off of those major players?
So I don't think it's as big an issue that they make it out to be. Of course, their argument would be that, we can't do that because our pricing will not be confidential anymore. And I think there's a way that can be set up so that it could be done. But you hit the nail on the head. That's the nut of the problem. I think you'll get full support on an individual or entity level. You'll get a majority of players in the industry that will want it. But from a market share perspective, now it gets a little dicey because the bigger market share will say, well, no, we don't want it. So who do you listen to? Do you listen to the individual players or market share?
Merci, Madame Moody, parce que vous êtes.
Thank you, Ms. Modi. Because you are representing Quebec, I would like to share with you that I had a conversation with Mr. Amin Raf. He's a beef producer in my region, and he was mentioning to me that it would be very relevant to have a Canadian reference price. He was even going so far as to say that it would be good to have one for Quebec all on its own. So I would like to have your point of view on that. Would a Canadian reference price be representative for Quebec, or do we need to go even more specific? The Canadian reference price would work for Quebec. Why? I'm in Quebec, and I am meeting federal regulations and standards, and I would even say that it's important for it to be Canada-wide. Otherwise, it would be too complicated, and we'll never achieve what we want to.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. One last question. You all talked about the current price of beef, and I'd like to get you to repeat something because I have colleagues who talk about food prices a lot in general. So for you, climate change and extreme weather events, are those one of the biggest causes of the prices that we're seeing?
Minutes is gone, but yeah, Mr. Perron, 2.5 minutes.
Microphone, please.
Avec la réponse.
Please go ahead and answer my colleague's question.
Est-ce que c'est vrai que les changements climatiques ont...
Is it true that climate change is one of the biggest factors? So the reality is, for climate change, when it comes to beef in particular, the fact that we have our farms, our animals go to pasture, and there are greenhouse gas emissions, we do counter that. And in Canada, we have very good practices. Oh, that's not really the question, because currently in the House, the House of Commons, we're having a debate that there are extreme weather events, climate change, droughts, flooding, that it has impacts on agricultural production. Is that true, or you are not at all affected by this? It does have an impact on our agriculture, but in the medium and long term, we do have AgriStab programs for our farmers. But for processors, there is no program. And what we're presenting here today is to ask that we also be protected. Okay, so there should be a program eventually, and our colleagues will be able to include that in their upcoming study. So I'd like to come back to prices. First of all, Ms. Moody, I'm very pleased to see you again. And colleagues, you were saying that all except major stakeholders will agree for the consensus. But what can you tell us? Will they just use the United States as an excuse? It's kind of like we saw in other areas. When there's a sector that is controlled by 2 or 3 big players, nothing can be done, and the consumers have to pay. What do you have to say about that?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question completely, but...
Je vais juste reprendre rapidement.
I'll just repeat quickly. Earlier you mentioned that the major processors, Cargill and so forth, would not want to disclose their prices. But it would already be public. They have to tell the United States their prices. Is that true or not? And any of the 3 of you can answer.
30 seconds, yeah.
That, it's not true. Canadian packers do not have to report to USDA on pricing. If you're in the U.S., you have to report, but you don't have to report if you're in Canada. So any basis differential developing in the Canadian market is hidden.
Il n'y a pas de régulation qui oblige.
There's no regulation that requires them to disclose that. So this means that, yes, they're using that for an excuse, but American producers do have to disclose it.
Now for 5 minutes. Mr. Gord?
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was a farmer. I sold my first animals at 14 years of age. And I lived at a time where there were many regional slaughterhouses. And we would pick up the phone and offer our animals to different slaughterhouses. And when there weren't as many animals, we could have a good price. But when there was a surplus, we had a hard time getting a good price. And over the years, there was a concentration, and there were many slaughterhouses, local slaughterhouses that disappeared in Quebec. It was a real scourge, and that changed the whole dynamic. We also saw a period of time when there was a surplus of meat in North America, and major American processors did dumping in Canada and in Quebec, and the prices became ridiculous, and things were let go for too long, so for 30 years, and now, at present day, you're generous, Ms. Modi. 7 years ago, well, I'm 62 years old, and other producers are my age, and they're going to retire. And later, farther down the line, we're going to see that there are problems caused in the sector. So, do you expect that there will be a beef shortage? Producers are pleased, but we're seeing problems elsewhere. So we want a spot price on living animals to have a good market signal. I can tell you, processors might be prepared to get together and be united when there's a lack of meat. But over the past 30 years, there was a surplus, and it wasn't the case. So do you really think that it's likely that there will be cooperation? I believe there will be cooperation. We learned our lesson. Food security can be achieved through diversification and having local slaughterhouses in a system that works. If Canada continues to allow slaughterhouses to close their doors, that means we're not taking care of our food security, and we cannot allow that to happen. So yes, if we were to have a fixed price that would allow us to see what the price is for Canadian product processed here, that is what the consumer wants. And that will create more demand for Canadian product. And when we produce in greater volume, the price is lower. And then we will be able to increase the 15% we're putting out now to 20%. We need a structural strategy to achieve that. Now, beef in Quebec, it is exported to the United States, and if it is processed down there, then it comes back to Canada as an American product. That is a major problem, and that is why if we had the structural program with a safety net that would allow local slaughterhouses to be able to buy and sell their product with a reference price saying this is what the Canadian price is, then we would be winning the battle. I would like to hear from other witness. Do we really have to defend our Canadian beef brand? We have a good product, but unfortunately, that is disappearing with what we're seeing in the United States. Mr. Vags.
I think, yes, it's important that we recognize that the industry is, number one, that it's important, that it has experienced challenges. And right now, that challenge, the cow-calf guy experienced challenges in the past 20 years, and we did nothing. or not enough. I shouldn't say we did nothing, but we didn't do enough to make sure that that segment read the signals and reinvested in the next generation, reinvested in infrastructure, and grew more cows. And that's the essence of why we have high prices today, too high for, you know, what many consumers. It's simple supply and demand. We do not have enough cows. But then if we look farther into the industry, what's the next level? Processing. If we continue just to say, you know what, we're going to let market dynamics play out, and let's look at that for a minute. It's not like these small beef processors are losing money and the big players are doing fine. Everybody's losing money. It's just that the big players have deeper pockets. So that's the issue. That's what the small guy needs, a little bit of help to get through this trough. Otherwise, he's going to be obliterated.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you. We'll go to the Liberals for 5 minutes. MP Connors.
Hi, good day, and thank you for coming out. Lots of interesting discussion. Excuse me, I got a bit of a cold. We've done a lot of talk about supply and demand, and in order for any industry to be successful and to be able to build their industry within Canada, we need to have a strong supply. Do you think implementing a reference margin here in Canada will help the supply side of especially at the cow-calf level? And I'll start with Mr. Vags, and then I'll go to Mr. Beretta.
I think it will. I think it's not the be-all and end-all. It's not, you know, all-encompassing solution, but it's a tool. And it's a tool that in Canada we don't have, that our counterparts around the world do have. And that's, in essence, that's it. Like, you know, why are we happy in Canada to not have that information at our fingertips where everybody else does? And it puts Thomas at a disadvantage. It puts me at a disadvantage. Why do we want to put ourselves at a disadvantage? It's not that hard to get the same tool in our toolbox that every other country has.
I would agree with what Calvin just said there. I think we need, when markets are tight like this, we want as accurate data and of what's actually happening in the Canadian economy as possible. The trends we're seeing with looking at the American future market is when Canadian cattle come to slaughter, they're actually slightly under the price of what the futures were saying at that point in time. So we're almost over marketing and over valuating the Canadian beef in a sense, which has pros and cons, and there's winners and losers, and depending on when the market and where it's at. But overall, yeah, we need our own pricing in times like these.
Alors, merci pour une très intéressante.
Thank you for that very interesting question. Mr. Chair, what's happening is that all major beef-producing countries not only take care of their producers, but also their processors. Here in Canada, we stopped after the ranchers, so we didn't get so far as the processors or the packers. So if we were to compare ourselves to other major countries who export here, who often dump here in Canada, they have reference prices and they also have other tools. And I would say that the animals would be processed here instead of going elsewhere. But we don't have we don't have those tools here. We stopped too early supporting our sector. And for the beef sector, that's serious because the slaughterhouse is the first step. I have been managing a slaughterhouse for 15 years, but we are left to our own devices, and it just doesn't work.
Thank you very much. I think back before COVID, there was a box beef pricing. If you're all familiar with that, was that beneficial? Would be something you'd like to see come back, or is something that we should move on to another system?
You're referring to the old Canfax box beef pricing reporting in Canada? So the short answer to that is it was beneficial somewhat. The issue with that data, it always came too late. So, you know, and then it just stopped because everybody, it became that was not mandatory anymore. I can't remember the exact reason why it stopped, but they're not doing it anymore. If we went back to that, you could, you know, reinvigorate that model, but really try to get it so that it's a lot more accurate and up to date.
Mr. Worrell?
Yeah, we wouldn't reject having more data. We wouldn't reject having more data at our fingertips. Like I've said before, knowing what's actually happening in the Canadian economy versus what's happening in the U.S. is only beneficial for us.
Je ne me rappelle pas de cette période particulière.
I don't remember that period in particular, but what I can say is that we cannot, or rather, if we don't support the 40 farms or the 40 slaughterhouses, then where are their products going to go? I don't think that's what we want. We have to have more transparency in the prices, and we have to have other tools to succeed. I think Canada needs to look into this, and it would be to the benefit of our own food sovereignty to do so.
Mr. Higgs, you mentioned a brief that CMC had put forward. Is there anything in that brief that would benefit this study? Do you?
20 seconds.
I believe so. That brief does not talk about mandatory price reporting. That brief is really targeted on a small packer margin support program. And I think this committee would be very behooved to look at it.
Can you send it to us?
I can.
Did you, the time's done. Yeah, if there's something, 10 seconds, go ahead.
I submitted these documents in English and in French to the clerk. I have submitted that.
Okay, so that was already submitted. Good.
Yes.
Okay, so thank you to our witnesses. We will suspend for 5 minutes while we get ready for the next panel. Thank you so much for joining us. I will not go through the basic script. I think both of our panelists understand the procedures, but pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Thursday, September 18, 2025, we're resuming our study on reference prices in beef and the pork supply chains. We have two witnesses joining us today. From the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, Diane Allen, and from the Department of Agriculture and Agri-Food, Donald Boucher, Director General. We'll start with the Department of Agriculture and Agri-Food, 5 minutes, and then we'll go next to the Canadian Food Inspection, and then we'll actually start the questions. So go ahead and welcome to the committee.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président, honorable.
Thank you very much, Chair. Honorable members of the committee, thank you for the invitation to appear before you today. I appreciate the opportunity to contribute to your study on reference prices in beef and pork supply chains.
Are pillars of our agri-food economy. In 2024, together, they generated approximately $23 billion in farm cash receipts, supported thousands of jobs in rural and remote communities, and contributed significantly to Canada's exports performance. Each year, roughly 60,000 cattle producers and 7,000 hog producers supply about 1.2 billion kilograms of beef and 2.2 billion kilograms of pork to domestic and international markets. These sectors are deeply integrated with North American supply chains. That integration creates important opportunities for growth and scale, but it also exposes Canadian producers and processors to external risks that must be managed carefully. Last week and earlier today, this committee heard from cattle and swine organizations. They raised concerns related to price transparency, and in particular, how reference prices are formed. A central challenge is that reference prices used in Canada for livestock and meat products are often linked to or influenced by U.S. market prices. Canada's meat industry has traditionally acted as a price taker in global markets, given our smaller scale relative to major producers such as the United States and the European Union. In the context of a highly integrated Canada-US market, where live animals and meat products move fluidly across the border, US prices are frequently used as a proxy for domestic price formation. Canadian prices are then adjusted to reflect exchange rates and local market conditions. Unlike the United States, Canada does not have a legislated requirement for mandatory wholesale meat price reporting by packers. Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada recognizes the sensitivity of price disclosure in a processing sector characterized by a limited number of key players. That said, the Government of Canada recognizes that transparency is essential to the efficient functioning of markets across all sectors. This is why we support industry-led efforts to explore ways to improve price transparency that are fair, effective, respectful of confidential business information, and supportive of food affordability. AAFC has supported this work in concrete ways. For example, in 2019, AAFC funded the Canadian Pork Council's Made in Canada Hog Price Study, conducted by Groupe AGECO and GIRA, which examined potential options for a Canadian price reference model. More broadly, the Government of Canada, through AFC and Statistics Canada, plays an important role in providing relevant, accurate, timely, and unbiased market information. This supports efficient markets, informed business decision, independent analysis, industry intelligence, and our own policy and program development. It is important to note that AFC's data collection framework is designed to protect business confidentiality. In many agricultural sectors, the government receives sufficient participation from industry and data providers to publish regular market updates, or established reporting mechanisms already exist. However, these conditions do not exist for domestic wholesale beef and pork pricing due to limited availability and confidentiality concerns. Agriculture et Agroalimentaire Canada continue de travailler en
AAFC continues to work closely with industry, provincial and territorial partners, and other federal departments to address challenges facing the Canadian meat sector. Key areas of focus include expanding market access through trade negotiations to maintain, diversify, and grow export opportunities, supporting investments in processing capacity and innovation through programs and initiatives, advancing industry-government collaboration through venues such as Animal Health Canada and Animal Protein Table, and improving data availability to support informed decision-making across the supply chain.
Are interconnected and require thoughtful, collaborative solutions. Today's discussion is an important step towards strengthening the resilience, transparency, and competitiveness of Canada's pork and beef supply chains. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, we'll go to the Department of Agriculture and Agri-Food. Welcome.
She's on mute.
Yeah, you're on mute. Yeah.
Apologies,
did
colleagues.
Did I say the wrong one? Sorry. The Canadian Food Inspection Agency. I apologize.
That's okay. Thank you. Thank you, Chair, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today on behalf of the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. The CFIA is a science-based regulatory organization. Our primary responsibility is to safeguard Canada's food supply and protect plant and animal health. This work protects public health, supports consumer confidence, and underpins economic activity across the entire food system, including the pork and beef supply chain. At the same time, the CFIA supports trade by protecting food safety and animal and plant health, and these strong safety systems build trust at home and help Canada access international markets. CFIA's frontline inspectors work to verify that industry meets Canada's rigorous food safety standards and regulations, which help maintain Canada's global reputation for having one of the world's strongest food safety systems. All in all, our work, we do apply an economic lens without ever compromising health and safety. While the CFIA does not set reference prices or market hogs or cattle, we do support the pork and beef sectors in several practical ways. First, we have enhanced our services to provide food businesses seeking a safe food for Canadians license to trade interprovincially and export. Our teams provide tailored guidance to help companies understand federal requirements and navigate the Safe Food for Canadians licensing process. We are currently working with 20 companies across the country, both small and large. Under the Ready to Grow pilot with Ontario, we are helping 10 provincially licensed meat processors seeking a federal license. 2 have already received their license, and 2 more are close to getting them. The CFI is also working with Ontario and Quebec on a slaughter service pilot. This initiative enables cattle producers in a remote area in Quebec to access slaughter services in an Ontario abattoir, with the meat returned to Quebec for sale under provincial oversight. The CFI has also heard from stakeholders that Canada's enhanced feed ban puts cattle industry at a competitive disadvantage to its American counterparts. In response, the CFI is moving forward regulatory changes that will allow certain tissues considered specified risk material to be included in non-ruminant livestock feed and other products, bringing Canada into alignment with the United States. Beyond licensing and slaughter access, the CFI also works with producers, provinces, and industry to strengthen food safety and animal health systems. Under the Health of Animals Act, the CFI develops and enforces livestock traceability requirements that really do support rapid response during a disease outbreak or food safety incidents. Traceability also underpins zoning arrangement and export certification by demonstrating that animals can be traced, contained, and managed effectively. Maintaining strong animal health is essential to Canada's agricultural competitiveness. Our export markets depend on Canada remaining free of diseases such as African swine fever and foot and mouth disease. That is why the CFI works closely with the pork and beef sector partners on prevention and preparedness through contingency planning and tabletop exercises with Animal Health Canada and enhanced border controls with the Canada Border Services Agency. Zoning arrangements are another essential tool to limit trade disruptions during an outbreak. We now have African swine fever zoning arrangements with trading partners such as the United States, the European Union, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Vietnam. In closing, the CFI supports economic activity in the pork and beef supply chains by protecting animal health, ensuring food safety, and enabling trade. Industry stakeholders are essential partners and we remain committed to working collaboratively to support a strong and competitive Canadian agricultural sector. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We'll go to the Conservatives for 6 minutes. We'll start off with Mr. Gourde, 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Président. Ma question va être pour M. Boucher. Le porc et le bœuf, c'est vraiment une industrie qui est très intégrée avec les États-Unis présentement. Pouvez-vous me dire la situation du bœuf? Le bœuf nous inquiète beaucoup parce que le prix a monté beaucoup, mais c'est parce qu'il manque d'offres présentement. OK.
You know that the situation is very concerning regarding beef prices. Can you talk to us about that situation? Yes, thank you very much for the question. So, yes, there is a dynamic in the North American beef market. We saw the traditional 2 to 3 year cycle for the beef price, and now it is a 7-year cycle. Since COVID-19, we have seen that entrant prices have increased, and there have been changes to imports with Mexico, from Mexico to the United States. That also caused changes to be made to the animals that were crossing the border between Canada and the United States. So we are seeing a beef cycle that is deviating from what we had seen traditionally for the length of it, and that has certainly created pressure for Canada. Can you do the same, but for pork this time? So on the side of pork, we are certainly seeing a dynamic where export markets are playing a major role, because in Canada, we're a bit different. So the industries are integrated, but Canada is in a slightly different situation regarding the United States, because we export 70% of our products to the United States. And when it comes to the United States, they have a domestic consumer rates that are higher. So with the free trade agreements, we see that the pork industry is currently going through a good price period, but there are also pressures there. They're facing the same pressures when it comes to the price of entrants. That is also an issue in the pork industry. When it comes to pork processing industry in Canada, it's better structured. There are more packing plants. Is that an advantage when compared to the Canadian beef sector when it comes to the relationship with the United States? Yes, the pork processing industry in Canada has more participants, more players, and there are bigger players that might have a more major impact. And that is similar. However, in the pork industry, there is an increase in the integration rate. So I think we're at 45% now for our pork industry. So our processors over time have positioned themselves to have to benefit more from the supply chain and have more animals processed locally. Could it be a benefit for producers and for the industry and for consumers that the mechanics? Will everyone be able to benefit or deal with the changes? So transparency of prices and the reference price would absolutely increase confidence when it comes to the supply chain, but there is a direct link from what the consumer pays. There are a number of factors that could influence the actual price paid in the grocery store, whether it's the negotiated prices, the price of transportation, the exchange rate, or the regulatory burden. Those would all play a role. But certainly, if there were increased transparency and if there were a reference price, that could be beneficial and increase coordination and cohesion in the supply chain. We won't talk about poultry, but the supply management system solves all the problems when it comes to setting a price, so that seems to be a given. We're in a situation in Canada where we have to export a lot of pork and a lot of beef. So it might be complicated to establish a reference price. Well, in our report in 2019 by the Canada Pork Council, that complexity was acknowledged. And there were even suggestions, for example, not to have one reference price in Canada, but different reference prices, because the export markets and the industries are different from the prairies to Quebec to Ontario. So there were suggestions, but ideally one price, a price could be set at the Canadian level, but also regionally, because it's important to take into account all the complexities and the variations from region to region. There is a robust world demand for protein, pork and beef. So Canada benefits from this economically. But how should we position ourselves? Well, as I said in my speaking notes, and thank you for the question. So yes, there is discussion ongoing in the industry to try and find a strategy to potentially have a reference price to also try and reflect. Thank you, Mr. Boucher.
MP Harrison, 6 minutes.
Thank you so much. First, we heard from small and medium producers about the kind of the constraints they're under and their need for a safety net and the critical role that they play in our domestic food security. So my question is, they brought up ag stability and the role that that plays for our producers, but how it ends at producers, and how they too need a safety net to protect our domestic supply chain. What role do you see that the government could play in the short or long term to help alleviate this risk that they are seeing?
So thank you very much for the question. So we have been hearing and meeting with the meat industry, the small and medium-sized abattoirs as well, and understanding the reality that they are facing, as I was mentioning, with the price cycle that is modified these days from the usual 2 to 3 year standard. And the request was made, and we took good note of that request for a safety net for those companies. And so therefore, for us, we definitely take good note, and we are currently looking at the situation and the difficulties that they are facing. For us, definitely an industry, a vibrant industry, is composed of players of multiple sizes, of big packers, including and small and medium-sized processors, to go into niche markets, have more to be able to deserve regional and local production. In terms of the best way, we are exploring different options. We've been in communication, for instance, with Farm Credit Canada and with other, and looking at the programs and how best they could help those players to make sure that we continue to have this diversity of offering for the livestock being produced in Canada.
Thank you. To Ms. Allen, I don't have a question specifically to the CFIA when it comes to beef reference pricing, because I'm not exactly sure what role the CFIA would play in any adjustment to how our pricing system works. But I will take this opportunity to ask you, after meeting with the Peterborough County Cattlemen's Association, one of the struggles that they are finding, and I think as a small producer, is that the lack of transparency from when your cow or cattle leave the farm and end up at the processing facilities, is the transparency of when there is condemnation of an animal, is that they're feeling very frustrated in the lack of transparency that they're experiencing when that happens to them, and then the substantial loss financially that they experience.
Well, thank you for the question. I don't believe we actually play in that particular frame, but I will take that back. I'm not an expert as to what that communication is between the abattoir or the slaughter facility to the individual who provided that particular livestock. So let me get back to the committee on that if that's agreeable. Thank you.
And just to be clear, Ms. Allen, again, does the CFIA play any role when it comes to beef referencing prices?
Unfortunately, no, we do not play any role in the beef pricing or marketing of hogs and cattle. Thank you.
Back to Mr. Boucher. I think that we've heard a lot too about the struggles producers are facing when it comes to many, many different aspects of being a producer in Canada, such as climate change and now beef reference pricing. And the free flow of cattle back and forth across the border. So I guess, what role does the government play in pricing for our producers in Canada when it comes to our domestic supply chain?
So thank you for the question. So in terms of role, insofar as mandatory price reporting and reference prices play, right now we do not have the same legislative framework as in the United States, where in the US since the 1990s, they've had legislation that makes the disclosing of prices mandatory. We do not have that frame here in Canada. We definitely support efforts right now in the absence of authorities. We support industry conversations, and we've been funding some reports to look at how best the industry could work amongst itself to look at prices, to look at a reference price, how to increase transparency within the supply chain. But at this point, our role in these questions is fairly limited. We do play a role in collecting information, in reporting on some of the information, not on prices, but we do play a role along with our colleagues at Statistics Canada to make sure that the information that is available, that can be reported on, is made available as widely as possible.
Okay. Good.
Okay. Thank you very much. Next, we'll go to Mr. Penon for 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And good day to our witnesses. Thank you for being with us. Mr. Boucher, we'll start with you. Earlier you said if we had a Canadian reference price, we should absolutely split it up by region. And that's not what Ms. Modi was saying. She was saying that a pan-Canadian price would do the job. So can you talk to us about how it could be an advantage to have a pan-Canadian price, for example, in a crisis situation? Thank you very much for this question. The observation that I shared came in part from the report that was commissioned in 2019 with AGECO. So I think that complexity in the Canadian pork sector led to the fact that a price should reflect that variation, but the options remain on the table. So if the industry were interested, perhaps ideally one flexible price changing by region could be what they want, but on the other end of the spectrum, perhaps the Canadian price is what they want. Thank you. So having a Canadian reference price, would it be useful in a health crisis situation? I think that is a question that can be applied to different scenarios, including health crises. If there were, for example, an outbreak of African swine fever in the United States, and then that would mean that the link between Canadian prices and American prices would be deconnected. So that is a possible scenario. Or the inverse could happen. There could be an outbreak in Canada and not in the United States. So I think it's really a case-by-case question, and I think that the industry should look into different scenarios to see if linking the prices would be advantageous. So if there was a crisis, but there were no pan-Canadian reference price, if we were too linked to the American price, how could that impact us? Thank you for the question. Unfortunately, I won't be able to answer very specifically. I think it really depends on what structure we're talking about and whether or not the Canadian government plays a role at knowing that it doesn't currently have the necessary authorities, because it would be the industry that would organize itself to have that price. Thank you. Ms. Allen, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, would it be prepared to put funding towards the establishment of a Canadian reference price if it were necessary?
This falls squarely outside of our mandate, but I'm sure we can entertain some sort of support vis-a-vis, not financially, but how we support the industry in making sure that we are able to address animal health issues and food safety issues.
Okay. Thank you for trying to answer. We'll say it like that. Mr. Boucher, if Canada were to decide to not go forward in establishing the reference price, you talked about regionalizing the prices. Would there be anything that would stop Quebec or another province from coming up with its own reference price?
Merci beaucoup pour la question.
Thank you very much for the question. Unfortunately, I do not have knowledge of the jurisdiction for the province to be able to answer that question. That's something that could be looked into, but it would really be up to the provincial governments to look at that. Okay. Does AAFC believe that having more transparency when it comes to prices would help the producers to have a fairer price? I think in general the answer is yes. But I would like to hear what your organization's vision is. Thank you very much for the question. Certainly, the Government of Canada and Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada is aware that this could play a role in price negotiation. However, we do recognize the importance that this transparency has in competitiveness for key players in the industry. So I hear that you're in favor, but I also hear your caveat. It's always difficult when we talk about prices. It's hard to nail down what the price is. And we realize that not a lot of numbers are being shared. So I see a lot of similarities, and I find this frustrating. When we're dealing with major industries, I think that is the state's responsibility to intervene. Ms. Modi gave an excellent presentation earlier. She made an excellent request, and I think everyone would come out a winner, not only the producers, but also the consumers, if we had more transparency, knowing where the meat comes from, because there's a big problem in Canada regarding labeling. And you're aware of this at the grocery store, I'm sure. It's difficult to know where the meat comes from. So I don't know why major companies are resisting to this. So I spoke a lot, but my final question, Mr. Chair, is this. I would like you, Mr. Boucher, to give us your opinion. So earlier, we were saying that GBS, Cargill, the major players in the United States, those major players do have to disclose their prices. But in Canada, those major players tell us that's impossible. Can you tell us your analysis of that?
Sorry. 15-second answer. Go ahead.
Donc, rapidement, merci.
So quickly, thank you for the question. So the American context is different for the number of players, first of all, and there are confidentiality rules that differ in the United States that would have to be looked into to see how we could look at the confidentiality of data and see how that could be applied to the Canadian context.
Next, we're going to do, we'll do one more round. We do have some committee business. Well, let's see. We'll go through this, and if we have a little bit of more time, I think we only need about 5-7 minutes for committee business, but we'll go to the Conservatives for 5 minutes, and then, okay, Mr. Bonk?
All right, so our study today is on the reference price for beef and pork supply chains. So we're going to talk a little bit maybe now about supply chains, and that would directly involve CFIA because they play a very important and valuable role when it comes to protecting our food safety and making sure that our slaughter plants and processing facilities meet the health standards that our domestic and international customers expect from us. I'm just wondering if there's been some talk about some progress on the SRM file, the specific risk material, and I was just wondering if you had any comments on that and you could fill in this committee on where you're at with that at the moment.
Thank you for the question. So we remain committed to advancing these changes quickly as possible. In fact, we are targeting a Canada Gazette Part 2 as early as June. So that's an update that I wanted to share. We meet regularly with industry as well to make sure that we are taking any sort of issues of feasibility, trade and economic implications across the entire supply chain. So we are working actively to try to make sure that we don't lose sight of those particular elements as we move forward on this BSCSRM file.
Excellent. As you know, we just completed a study on red tape reduction in CFIA and PMRA. And we're just wondering, now that there's been some cuts announced for CFIA, how will that affect the inspection and regulation of the plants? Were you expecting there to be any delays or any problems with that?
Well, thank you for the question. So, like every other department across the public service, we did actually have cuts. At the outset, we tried to protect our front line, and we are trying to make sure that emergency readiness remain focused on our core mandate, food safety and services. So, the cuts will be more centralized to non-service oriented areas. And so we do have cuts projected, but the services and the frontline staff are protected.
I had witnesses here earlier today, and they are federally inspected medium-sized plants in Canada. And we hear a lot about provincially inspected plants who are unable to sell product across Canada. They're not exporting, but they want to sell their product to, across the border. Maybe Saskatchewan Farm has a farm-to-plate business that they would like to promote, and they've got customers who want their product. At the moment, it is legal for them to use provincially inspected plant. Now we know with the CIFTA agreement, the Canadian Internal Free Trade Agreement, we're supposed to be breaking down interprovincial trade barriers, and the Prime Minister has talked in depth about this, and we're supposed to have this done by July, I believe. Can you maybe fill in the committee of where we're at with that? Because we have a lot of producers who are asking.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So as you mentioned earlier, on November 19th, the regulations under the Free Trade and Labour Mobility Act came into play to protect the health and safety of Canadians and Canada trade diversification goals. The regulations provided an exception for food regulated under the Safe Food for Canadians Act. That said, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, we are working across multiple provinces under different pilots in order to try to see how we can facilitate movement of product, whether it's slaughter capacity and getting new entities licensed to the Safe Food for Canadian Act.
Excellent. Okay. Will there be a reduction in food inspectors at processing plants in Canada?
Thank you for the question. As I mentioned earlier, we are trying to protect our front line, and so cuts are going to be very much behind back office oriented areas. So front line is protected and preserved, and food safety will not be impacted.
Okay. Maybe I'll just turn to you, Mr. Chair, for a second. Because I am substituting in today for Mr. Bragdon, there's a motion that I believe that I need to read into. Okay. Put on notice. So that pursuant to Standing Order 108.2, in light of the federal government's decision to close multiple agriculture and agri-food Canada research centres and experimental farms, including the Lacombe Research and Development Centre in Alberta, the Napan Experimental Farm in Nova Scotia, the committee undertake that the emergency study to examine the government's rationale and decision-making process, as well as the economic and research impacts, including job losses and effects on rural communities, that the study commence as soon as possible, that the committee hold up to 4 meetings or more as needed as the committee reports its findings to the House.
Okay, thank you. The motion has been put on notice. We did receive a correspondence today that I don't believe I've circulated yet, but it's from the department specifically speaking to this issue, so I'll have that distributed as well. But the motion has been put on notice, and I guess I don't need to do anything at this point. Yeah.
No. It's on notice.
On notice.
He's moving it.
Yeah.
You're moving the.
He's moving the motion.
Yes. Okay. So and this was put on notice last week,
That's
right?
correct.
Okay. So the motion is now being moved. We'll open it up for debate. Okay. MP Chattel.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
One of the proposal, and we discussed amongst the parties, is that it would be good to have a subcommittee meeting, I suggest on Thursday, because we have a lot of motion, a lot of studies, so we need really a work plan, and then we can see how this motion will fit into it.
Okay.
But I suggest that we postpone voting on this motion until we come with a plan, and then we vote on the full plan.
Okay. Mr. Epp.
Yes, I think there's discussion before. I think I would be in favor of adopting the motion and allowing the scheduling, because there are a whole bunch of motions and a whole bunch of studies that are looking to be left up to the subcommittee on Thursday.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Perrault.
Yes. First of all, we would have to add the Sainte-Foy Research Center to the motion. My assistant is going to send that text to the clerk. And other than that, the motion is worthwhile, so perhaps we could start at the subcommittee.
Making an amendment to the motion based on adding this piece, or you said you were going to circulate something?
Ben, en fait,
So, in fact, all I want is to add the Sainte-Foy Research Center. But I also said that we could perhaps do that at the subcommittee or immediately after the committee if we have the resources to do that, and then we could continue with the study.
Juste pour savoir.
I just wanted to know, because I also have amendments to make to the motion, so I would have preferred to discuss all of that in the subcommittee. So my question is really a procedural question. Do we have to vote on the motion now, or can we wait to hold a subcommittee meeting and bring the motion back on the table at that time and come up with a complete working plan? Because if not, then we're going to get into a debate, because I too have amendments that I wish to make to that motion. So I just had that procedural question. Do we absolutely have to vote now? For a yes or a no? That's where I'm a bit confused.
You know, Mr. Bong has moved a motion that was put on notice a week ago. The motion is actually on the floor now. It's we're actually in debate, and the only way to proceed is either Mr. Bong says he withdraws the motion, or we vote on the motion. That's the only two pathways we have. So currently on the floor, we do have the motion, and I'll correct myself. There aren't two pathways. There's obviously many pathways, but currently on the floor, we have a motion that's open for debate. Are there any other speakers? Okay, go ahead.
I'd just like to mention that it's been the consensus of this committee to view everything we do here through an economic lens to help support agriculture. This is particularly time sensitive, so I hope the sooner we can move this along, the better.
Mr. Gord?
On est encore sur un sous-amendement de M. Perron.
So we're still debating Mr. Perron's amendment, and I think it's important, too, to add the Sainte-Foy Research Center.
Amendment to the motion. So he said that he was going to circulate something?
wait.
Yeah, but if
Yes.
he did not say, I'm going to move that we amend the motion. So,
okay,
Mr.
ben,
Perron?
ouais, c'est parce-
That's because I also said that I suggested we can continue this discussion later at the subcommittee. But yes, I do move that we amend it to add the Sainte-Foy Research Center to the motion.
Okay, so we have an amendment on the floor. MP Chatel?
Est-ce que c'est possible?
Is it possible to adjourn the current debate we're having on this motion and to bring it back on the table at our next subcommittee meeting? At the subcommittee, we will look at our full game plan until June. And at that time, we'll be able to predict exactly how many days we want to spend on that study, and we'll be able to deal with the amendments as well. So my suggestion is to adjourn debate on this motion and come back after subcommittee to vote on it at our next committee meeting. Because at the subcommittee, we will be able to look at all of the amendments to the motion that we have in our inventory.
Okay, so if it's a dilatory motion, the motion is to adjourn debate on this actual motion. I will call the vote now. I just call the vote, right? There's no debate on this. On MP Chatel's motion to adjourn debate on this motion as amended, which we still haven't seen the circulation of the, okay, we have it, okay. Okay, it was pretty simple, so yeah. Okay, so all those in favor of adjourning debate on the motion, raise your hand.
The modification or on the motion?
Both.
Both.
Yeah.
Both, okay.
All in favor? Opposed? Okay, so that is carried. We've adjourned debate on that. I'll go back to my list. I believe at this point I'm going to MP Connors for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Sorry for the interruption. I got to go back to we had a system, the box beef system. Are you familiar with that? Can you, from AFC's point of view, can you give us some reasons why that was stopped, or if there's any positives to it, negative to it for the industry?
So thank you for the question. You're talking about the box beef report, right?
The box beef report,
yes.
price report.
So
yeah.
my understanding is that this report was discontinued right around the time of the COVID pandemic. There were some technical difficulties getting the information, and there were some concerns with regards to some of the key packers submitting data for that report. Actually, AFC did play a role in collecting that data, submitting the data to CanFax for a while. So the department, we did volunteer to step in and try to keep the report going at some point around the time of the pandemic, because of obviously abattoirs had a lot on the go with dealing with the sanitary issues within their plants. So at that point, there were concerns around the ability to continue to provide that data. And so around 2020, that report was discontinued. That is my understanding as to why it was discontinued.
Do you know if that was the industry decided not to continue, or did AFC not decide?
It was due to the difficulty around continuing to access the data from the industry, from the abattoirs.
Okay. Was that program or report beneficial to the industry, and has there been any discussion about just bringing that back? Was there any discussion with the industry about bringing that back?
So thank you for the question. As far as I can tell, there hasn't been any recent conversation that I'm aware of to bring it back. I think we've heard from a previous witness that maybe there were some concerns. So I would not be in the best position to respond to that question.
Okay. You used in your discussion dynamic North American beef market, and long we talked about a robust world demand for pork and beef. How would this new reference margin or reference pricing benefit us in trade, in nationally or in our direct market? How would that benefit? How would this be able to benefit us?
So thank you for the question. My understanding is that a Canadian reference price would take into consideration elements of our domestic marketing regime, including quality assurance systems. Could be in terms of like meeting market requirements. So we would be better position with the Canadian reference price to reflect those realities. But again, with the high level of integration with the U.S. market, it has been deemed for quite some time that the U.S. reference price was a good proxy. I think that the Canadian reference price, my understanding is that you could reflect some of the specificities within the Canadian production through some of the attributes based on a cutoff price with some coefficient that do reflect some of those specificities like transport costs, quality attributes that the producers and packers would be putting on the product itself.
And I think you mentioned that there's already been discussions ongoing with the industry. Have you, AFC, been in discussions with the industry about introducing a Canadian reference price? Sorry.
Thank you for the question. There has been some conversations to which AFC was a part of, but essentially at this point, the recent conversations have been mostly amongst industry players at this point.
Thank you very much. And I did give Mr. Blanc 4 minutes. You only took 4, and I'm going to give Mr. Perron 2 minutes to wrap up. Yeah.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Boucher. The Canadian Pork Council President, Mr. Voix, at the last meeting mentioned an example, and I think it is, he was talking about how important it is to have a local reference price, and we saw the trade war between China and the U.S. that has driven prices down for our producers. So having a local index price would better protect our producers against these external factors that we have no control over. Do you agree? I think it is fair to say that in certain situations, a Canadian price would disconnect us from that external dynamic, but we do need to weigh the pros and cons for an integrated market. So the Quebec Pork Council President Mr. Roy was talking about the Quebec market, and we often talk about removing interprovincial trade barriers and so forth, but he said if there's a lot of pork that doesn't come from Quebec that ends up in packing plants in Quebec. Have you analyzed this situation? Do you think there could be any impacts? Has your organization analyzed this situation? Thank you very much for the question. We are aware of the different specifications when it comes to pork in Canada, including the joint plan with Quebec, but we have not analyzed those dynamics when it comes to the Canadian price. No. Thank you. So yourself and perhaps Ms. Allen also. So one or the other. One and or the other. So small packing plants, small slaughterhouses. Should we start considering these companies as essential infrastructure? We will submit an answer regarding small slaughterhouses. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for being here. Thank you to both of our witnesses. We appreciate your time. Committee, we've got a couple of pieces that we need to work on. First, I'd like to ask members for their consent to adopt the budget for the study of reference prices in beef and pork supply chains. Draft version was sent out. It was circulated, and I hope we can, is everyone okay with that if we approve that budget? Okay. There is an additional supplemental that was provided to everyone for the Government Regulatory Reform Initiative. It's gone above its estimated 8 meetings, and we need to increase, I guess, the supplementary amount requested. Are folks okay with that? That's yes, 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 yes. Which comes from your dues. So, yeah. So, is everyone fine with that? Yeah. Okay. So we're good. Also, this Thursday, we need to have a subcommittee meeting. Is that the proper term? Subcommittee? Yeah. So we need to have the meeting. We've got a lot of different items that we need to work out. So I would suggest that this Thursday from in addition to that, we don't have witnesses. We have no other witnesses currently. So what I'd like to suggest is that we dedicate that meeting to the subcommittee so we can work some things out and set the direction for the next, I believe we'll be here for another 22 meetings roughly. Is that right? 11 more weeks, Mr. Epp?
Yeah, you're putting that in writing that we will be sitting through another.
So we will. So we have scheduled. We have scheduled another 11 weeks, 22 meetings, I believe, and this would be a good opportunity for us to just explore the direction we need to go in. So are we fine with that? That would mean that the vice chairs, I think that's how it works. The vice chair's the chair. We sit down, we figure things out. So next Thursday, well, this Thursday, sorry, will be just that specific component of the meeting. So folks are fine with that? Is there any other items, MP Chatel?
Just want to make sure, so that means we completed that study for the analyst?
That's really up to us. Do we feel like the study is complete? Yeah. Okay.
Pour les analystes,
for the analysts, the only thing is, in their own research and the documents from the witnesses, could we have a breakdown of the prices and the factors that affect the prices? So we heard a number of witnesses talk about a number of different factors. So if we could say, for example, if we take beef, here are the factors and their impacts. If we could go through what the witnesses said, Statistics Canada, the CDE, and the written submissions to committee. So I know that there already are some in your base documents that you have provided, but if we could also include that in the report, please. That's all I would say, because I think that the witnesses were very clear.
And all we're doing right now, I just need an agreement for Thursday's meeting, but the drafting instructions, we'll schedule a meeting to do that specifically. There'll be time to do that. So, Mr. Bonk?
Response quickly. CanFax would have all that information. It's already compiled.
Okay. So is there a will to have the subcommittee meeting next, sorry, I keep saying next, this Thursday? Okay. Any other items? Is it the will of the committee to adjourn the meeting? Okay, thank you.